The investigation begins in a quiet room in Oxford, England. Inside the Ashmolean Museum, among objects gathered from across human history, there is a piece of fired clay. It is not large. It measures roughly 20 by 9 centimetres, small enough to be held in 2 hands. It is not made of a precious material. It is terracotta, baked river clay, one of the most common and ancient materials used for building and for writing. This object is the Weld-Blundell Prism. It was created nearly 4,000 years ago, around the year 1800 BCE, likely in the ancient Sumerian city of Larsa, in what is now southern Iraq. Its form is deliberate. It is not a flat tablet for a quick note or a commercial receipt. It is a prism with 4 sides, each one covered in columns of script. The marks are cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing of ancient Mesopotamia. A scribe would have taken a stylus, likely a cut reed, and pressed these shapes carefully into the damp clay, one by one, before the prism was fired in a kiln, turning the soft earth into hard, durable ceramic. The surface is a dense matrix of information. Thousands of tiny, precise impressions pack the 4 columns. To a modern eye, it looks less like writing and more like a complex textured pattern. Yet every single wedge is a component of a syllable or word, a unit of recorded language. The effort involved in creating such an object is immense. The planning of the columns, the consistency of the script, the care taken to avoid smudging the clay before it was fired, all of it speaks to a purpose beyond the everyday. This was not a disposable document. It was a monument in miniature, an official record intended for preservation. It was made to last. In a world where most of what humanity has created has turned to dust, this simple block of baked mud has survived. It has outlasted the empires that rose and fell after it was made. It has survived the decline of the language written upon it and the civilizations that used that language. It was eventually buried, lost in the earth of Iraq for millennia, before being excavated in the early 20th century. Now it rests, stable and silent, in a climate-controlled case. The physical object itself is a known quantity. We can measure it, analyze the chemistry of its clay, and place it in its historical context. It is a solid, verifiable piece of evidence, and like all such evidence, it anchors us. It gives us a place to begin. The fundamental question it poses is not about its material, but about its contents. What knowledge was considered so important, so essential to the identity of the people who made it, that it had to be recorded in this permanent form? What story is encoded in these columns of tiny wedges? The rows of cuneiform on the clay prism are not a private letter or a merchant's ledger. They are a formal, public document. It is a version of one of the most significant and perplexing texts to survive from the ancient world, the Sumerian King List. The list's purpose seems straightforward at first. It records the succession of rulers in the land of Sumer, in southern Mesopotamia. It tracks the movement of power, or what the text calls kingship, as it passes from one city to another. The text begins with a declaration. It states that kingship first descended from heaven. It settled in a city called Eridu. Then it began to move, from Eridu to Bad Tibira, from there to Larak, a sequence of cities and the kings who ruled them. But as the list unspools, a fracture appears in its timeline. A deep, world-altering rupture is recorded in just a few words. The text states, "The flood swept over." After this event, the list continues. Kingship once again descends from heaven, this time to the city of Kish. But the list is now permanently divided into 2 ages, the time before the flood and the time after, the antediluvian world and our own. And it is in the time before the flood that the numbers on the prism become impossible. The very first king listed, Alulim, who ruled from Eridu, is said to have held the throne for 28,800 years. The second king, Al-Aljah, reigned for 36,000 years. In total, the 8 kings who ruled before the flood are assigned reigns that add up to 241,200 years. This is the central problem of the Weld-Blundell Prism. It is not a vague mythological age. It is a precise accounting of impossible time. These numbers are recorded with the same deliberate administrative clarity as the much shorter, more plausible reign lengths that appear later in the list for kings who are known from other historical sources. The text does not signal that these first numbers are symbolic. It presents them as fact. The document is an authentic artifact from around 1800 BCE. The translation is a matter of established scholarship. The numbers are there, pressed into the clay. The problem is not the evidence itself, but its meaning. It is an official history of a world that does not seem to fit inside our own. If you have ever encountered an official record, a map, a charter, a census, that contained a detail so strange it seemed to belong to another kind of reality, I would be interested to learn what it was, and where. The list forces a question upon us. Are these numbers a code, a mistake, or are they a memory of something else compressed into a form that we no longer understand? To begin answering that, we have to look past the numbers themselves and into the world view that created them. What did the Sumerians mean by kingship, and why did it come from the heavens? The numbers on the clay prism create a clear point of difficulty for any modern reading. But before exploring what those reign lengths might mean, it is essential to understand the kind of document we are looking at. The Sumerian King List is not a neutral chronicle assembled by a detached observer. The text itself announces its purpose and its worldview from the very first lines. It begins with a declaration. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This opening statement is the key to the entire document. It frames kingship not as a human political invention, but as a fundamental component of the cosmic order, handed down from the divine realm to the human one. This is a theological and political claim, not a historical observation. It establishes that legitimate rule is singular, sacred, and originates outside of human agency. From this perspective, a king does not rule simply because of power or inheritance, but because he is the current holder of a divine institution that has existed since the beginning of time. This concept immediately shifts our investigation. We are not reading a simple list of names and dates. We are reading an argument about the nature of power and legitimacy. The second crucial feature is the document structure. The list of rulers is not continuous. It is divided into two distinct ages, separated by a single, world-altering event. After listing the first group of kings and their impossibly long reigns, the text states plainly, "Then the flood swept over." This is the great hinge upon which the entire history turns. Every king is either antediluvian, before the flood, or postdiluvian, after it. The flood is not just another event in a sequence. It is the fundamental rupture in the timeline, the end of one world and the beginning of another. After this cataclysm, the text records that kingship once again descended from heaven, establishing a new line of succession in a world cleansed and remade. This before and after structure gives the flood an immense ideological weight, framing it as the ultimate test of cosmic order and divine will. Furthermore, the kingship described in the list is mobile. It moves from city to city. After its time in Eridu, the text notes that Eridu was defeated and the kingship was taken to another city like Bad Tibira, and then another. This creates the impression of a single, unified Sumer, ruled sequentially by one dominant city at a time. This, according to most scholarly analysis, is a deliberate simplification. The archaeological and textual record from Mesopotamia suggests a more complex reality, with multiple powerful city-states often coexisting and competing for influence. The King List smooths over this messy history, creating a tidy, linear narrative of a single transferable kingship. It presents an idealized past to justify a political reality or ambition in the present in which it was written. Taken together, the divine origin, the flood rupture, and the mobile, singular kingship, these features reveal the text's true function. It is an ideological document. Its primary goal is not to record history with factual precision, but to construct a foundational story that legitimizes the entire institution of kingship. It argues that rule is ancient, divinely sanctioned, and has the strength to survive even the most total catastrophe. It provides a charter for civilization, grounding the authority of the contemporary ruler in an unbroken chain of tradition, reaching back to the gods and the world before the flood. Understanding this purpose is the necessary step before we can return to the problem of the numbers. They exist within this framework, serving this ideological goal. The numbers inscribed on the prism present a clear break with human experience. A reign of 28,800 years for a single king, followed by another of 36,000 years, cannot be read as a literal account of a human life. This is not a matter of skepticism, it is a matter of biology. So, the text is not giving us a simple chronicle. It is presenting us with a code that requires interpretation. Before any attempt to read that code, it is useful to understand the mathematical language the Sumerian scribes were using. Their system was not based on tens, like ours. It was a sexagesimal system, based on the number 60. This might seem unfamiliar, but we inherit fragments of it every day. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. The Sumerians saw a particular power and completeness in the number 60 and its multiples. It can be divided cleanly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This made it an elegant tool for calculation, for astronomy, and perhaps for theology. The numbers on the King List, like 28,800 or 36,000, are not random. They are multiples of 60 large and symmetrical numbers that would have felt significant and orderly within that mathematical worldview. This brings us to the first major scholarly interpretation. This view suggests the antediluvian rains are not historical measurements at all, but symbolic or mathematical statements. The numbers may have been chosen for their numerological significance, their relationship to the base 60 system, or their connection to cosmological cycles that are no longer understood. In this reading, the scribe is not trying to record the past. They are trying to express an ideal of a perfect, stable, ancient order through the beauty of numbers. The rains are long because they exist in a different kind of time, a sacred mythical time before the world was broken by the flood. A second interpretation attempts to find a more direct historical signal inside the numbers. This reading proposes that a name like Alulim does not represent a single person, but an entire dynasty, or a long period during which the city of Eridu held preeminence. The 28,800 years would then be an aggregated total for that entire era. This is an attempt to rationalize the numbers, to see them as a compressed memory of political history rather than pure myth. It suggests the list remembers that certain cities were powerful for very long periods, even if the exact duration has been exaggerated or encoded. Here, the contrast is between an individual king and a collective political age. A third view sees the numbers primarily as an ideological tool. This connects back to the text's purpose, to legitimize the institution of kingship. By assigning immense reigns to the earliest kings, those who received kingship directly from heaven, the list creates a history of near-infinite depth and stability. It argues that kingship is not a recent human invention, but an ancient, cosmic institution with a pedigree stretching back into a time of giants. The greater the number, the greater the authority it confers on the entire system that follows. The purpose of the number is not to be accurate, but to be impressive. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. The numbers could be symbolic, aggregate, and ideological all at once. But what they all share is a rejection of the literal reading. No mainstream archaeological or historical scholarship accepts these figures as the biological lifespans of individual human rulers. The text is a real artifact, and the numbers are real as writing, but their meaning is a problem of history and worldview, not a record of impossible biology. The question is not whether the numbers are true in a literal sense, but what kind of truth their authors were trying to preserve. This brings us to the most dramatic feature of the list. After 8 kings and a total of 241,200 years of rule, the text records a catastrophic rupture. A single line declares, "The flood swept over." After the long, dreamlike reigns of the antediluvian kings, the rhythm of the Sumerian King List does not simply change, it breaks. A single, catastrophic event cleaves the timeline in two, separating a remote, almost mythological era from the one that follows. After listing the 8 kings who ruled from 5 cities, the text states plainly, "The flood swept over." Everything that comes after this line is different. Kingship must once again descend from heaven, and the reigns of the new kings, while still long, begin a slow, uneven march toward believable human lifespans. The flood is the pivot point. It is the structural rupture around which the entire history of kingship is organized. To understand why a flood would be chosen for this role, we have to consider the land itself. Mesopotamia is the Greek name for the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. It is a vast, flat alluvial plain, built up over millennia by the silt deposited by these two powerful and unpredictable waterways. For the people who built the first cities there, the rivers were the source of all life. They brought fertile soil, water for irrigation, and pathways for trade. but they also brought sudden destructive power. Annual flooding was a normal part of the agricultural cycle, but a truly devastating flood, a year when the rivers rose far beyond their banks, scouring the landscape and erasing towns from the map, was a recurring and existential threat. Such an event, when it happened, would not have been remembered as a simple historical data point. It would have become a scar on the collective memory, a story told for generations, a dividing line in time separating the world that was lost from the world that had to be rebuilt. This is the raw material of what we might call cultural memory, and the King List is not a lone witness to this memory. It exists within a family of related Mesopotamian flood narratives. The story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, tells of a pious king who is warned by a god to build a great boat to survive a deluge sent to destroy humankind. In the later Akkadian epic of Atrahasis, the flood is sent by the gods to quiet a noisy, overpopulated earth. Perhaps the most famous version is woven into the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero seeks out the survivor Utnapishtim, who tells him the story of the Great Flood as a path to understanding mortality and the limits of human life. These are not identical reports. They are distinct literary works, each using the shared memory of a great flood for its own theological or philosophical purpose. What their existence demonstrates is not necessarily a single, verifiable event that happened on a specific date. Rather, it shows that a catastrophic flood was a fundamental concept in the Mesopotamian worldview, a powerful shared template for understanding catastrophic loss, divine power, and the fragility of human works. The world could be unmade by water. It had happened before. The texts then are consistent. The memory is powerful. A world existed, and it was washed away. This leads our investigation from the clay tablet to the ground itself. If the story of this event is so deeply embedded in the region's literature, is there a corresponding memory written into the layers of the earth? Can archaeology find a physical trace of the flood that swept over? The text on the clay prism tells a story of a world before and a world after a great flood. The Mesopotamian literary tradition remembers this rupture in multiple forms, but an investigator must eventually turn from the text to the ground. If such a catastrophic flood occurred, it should have left a physical trace, a scar in the geology of the river plains. In the 1920s, the search for that scar seemed to reach a conclusion. At the site of the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was conducting extensive excavations. As his teams dug down through the layers of history, through strata containing pottery, tombs, and the foundations of buildings, they hit something unexpected. Below a clear level of human occupation, the archaeology stopped. It was replaced by a massive clean deposit of water-laid silt. This layer was, in some places, more than 3 meters thick. It was a sterile band containing no artifacts, no pottery shards, no signs of human life. It was pure river mud. Below this thick deposit, the signs of occupation began again, belonging to an even earlier period. Woolley, in a moment of public excitement, announced that he had found evidence of the Great Flood. The story was carried in newspapers around the world. Here, the investigation reaches a critical fork in the road. On one path, the sediment layer at Ur becomes proof of the myth. On the other, it becomes a different kind of evidence, something more complex and perhaps more interesting. Later archaeology provided crucial context. Similar, though not identical, flood deposits were found at other Mesopotamian sites, like Kish and Shuruppak. But the layers did not align perfectly in time. They were not part of one single, synchronous sheet of sediment laid down by a global deluge. They were instead the clear signatures of severe, destructive river floods, the kind of epic but regional disasters that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were certainly capable of producing. This does not diminish the power of the discovery. It refines it. The evidence in the ground is not for a flood that covered the world's mountains. It is for floods that could completely erase the world known to the people of southern Mesopotamia. For a society whose universe was the river valley, a flood that buried cities, scoured fields, and altered the course of the rivers was, in every meaningful sense, the end of the world. The physical evidence and the cultural memory do not have to be a perfect one-to-one match. A local catastrophe can become the raw material for a totalizing myth, a story that preserves the human meaning of the rupture long after the silt has settled. The silt layer at Ur shows us how a world can be physically buried. And this raises a much larger question. If a regional river flood can erase cities from the map, what happens when a global process erases the map itself? The silt layers found at Ur and other Mesopotamian cities tell a true story. It is a story of regional disaster, of river plains inundated, and of a world for a specific people washed away. But the scale of that evidence does not match the scale of the memory preserved in the King List, a memory of a world utterly broken in two, a quote 4 and unquote 5. This presents a new path for our investigation. If a local flood isn't the complete answer, perhaps the question needs to be reframed. What if the search for a single, sudden catastrophe has distracted from a much slower, larger, and more certain mechanism of erasure, a process not of myth but of planetary physics? To find it, we have to leave the river valleys of Iraq and look at the entire globe as it was at the end of the last great ice age. Our starting point is a period geologists call the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago. At that time, immense sheets of ice, in some places miles thick, covered much of North America, Europe and Asia. An almost unimaginable volume of the planet's water was not in the oceans, but was locked away on land as ice. Then the world began to warm. Over thousands of years that ice melted, and all of that water had to go somewhere. It flowed back into the sea. This wasn't a single event. It was a long, slow transformation of the face of the Earth. The scale of this change is difficult to grasp, but the evidence for it is unambiguous. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and decades of geological study, the global average sea level since the last glacial maximum has risen by more than 120 meters. That is nearly 400 feet. This one number changes the entire map of the human past. The coastlines we see today are a recent feature. The continental shelves, vast, gently sloping plains that extend from the edge of our continents, were not always seafloor. They were coastal lands, river valleys, and estuaries. They were precisely the kinds of resource-rich environments where human communities would have flourished. An area of land larger than the entire continent of Europe has disappeared beneath the waves. This process represents a quiet, planetary-scale erasure of archaeological evidence. Anything built of wood, hide, or fibre would have decayed. Earthworks would have been scoured away by currents. Even stone structures could be buried under millennia of marine sediment. The human story of these drowned lands is not just lost. For the most part, it is now profoundly difficult to access. This was a slow, grinding process, a change happening over a span of time far too long for any single generation to perceive as a crisis. But was it always slow? Was the water's rise always a steady, predictable creep? Or were there periods within this great thaw when the sea rose with an alarming, undeniable speed? The slow, steady rise of the oceans after the ice receded is one story. It paints a picture of gradual change, of coastlines migrating inland over thousands of years, giving ecosystems and human communities time to adapt. But the geological record preserves a more complicated history. The process was not always gradual. There were periods of startling acceleration. Evidence for these episodes comes from places far from the ancient ice sheets themselves, from the drowned coral reefs of the Caribbean and the Pacific. Corals are precise environmental recorders. They grow upwards, towards the sunlight, at a known rate. If the sea level rises slowly, the reef keeps pace. But if the sea rises too quickly, the corals are submerged in water too deep for sunlight to penetrate. They drown. And in their death, they leave a clear marker of a rapid inundation. By drilling cores through these ancient reefs and dating the layers, geologists can reconstruct the history of the sea level with remarkable precision. And what that record reveals is a series of catastrophic events. The most dramatic of these is known to science as Meltwater Pulse 1A. It occurred around 14,600 years ago. Over a period of less than 500 years, global mean sea level rose by as much as 20 meters. That is a rate of more than 4 centimeters per year, a speed visible within a single human lifetime. The primary source for this immense volume of water is still debated, but the leading candidate is the partial collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet. For any human communities living on the low-lying coastal plains of that time, this would not have been a gradual retreat. It would have been a permanent generational flood. A river valley that was a day's walk to the sea would, in the span of a few generations, become a wide, brackish estuary. A coastal forest would become a salt marsh, and then an open bay. The ancient shorelines, the very places where human populations were likely most concentrated, rich with marine resources, were not just covered, but scoured and obliterated by the advancing water. This is not a myth. It is a geological process, recorded in stone, and it presents a fundamental problem for our understanding of the deep past. It creates a planetary-scale mechanism for the erasure of evidence. Any artifacts, any structures, any campsites made of perishable materials on those drowned coastlines are likely gone forever, or buried under meters of marine sediment far out on the continental shelves. The absence of evidence in these vast submerged zones is not proof that nothing was there. Instead, the evidence we do have, the evidence of the pulse itself, suggests that these areas are precisely where the record of human life would be most thoroughly destroyed. It creates a visibility problem on a scale that archaeology is only beginning to confront. The slow, grinding power of water and ice can erase the past. It can drown coastlines and bury landscapes under hundreds of meters of sediment and ocean. This is a fundamental challenge for anyone trying to understand deep history. An absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it makes the work slow and often uncertain, and yet sometimes the earth preserves a moment with perfect, startling clarity. To find one such moment, the investigation must leave the river plains of Mesopotamia and the submerged shelves of the world's oceans. It must travel to the Tularosa Basin of southern New Mexico, to a place now known as White Sands National Park. Here, a vast field of brilliant white gypsum sand dunes stretches for hundreds of square kilometers. It is a stark, beautiful landscape. But this was not always a desert of sand. During the last ice age, it was a land of grasslands, streams, and at its heart, a large body of water named Lake Otero. The shores of this ancient lake were not sand, but wet, soft mud, and people walked there. In recent years, within the layers of sediment that were once the muddy edges of that lake, archaeologists have found something extraordinary. Not tools, not buildings, not pottery. They found fossilized human footprints, tracks of adults and children, left in the soft ground as they moved across the landscape. They are not impressions of a civilization, but the direct, unmistakable trace of human presence. When these footprints were first dated, the results were profound. To confirm them, researchers from the United States Geological Survey, or USGS, used multiple independent lines of evidence, and the age held. The scientific consensus places these footprints between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. This is a quiet but revolutionary fact. It places people in North America during the height of the last glacial maximum, a time when massive ice sheets still covered much of the continent. Long before the earlier Sumerian cities, before the invention of writing, before the development of agriculture as we know it, people were walking the shores of a lake in what is now New Mexico. The footprints are not a story, or a myth, or a king list that requires interpretation. They are a direct physical record, a single moment of passage, preserved for millennia. But a record of what exactly? What does a footprint from 23,000 years ago allow us to understand about the people who made it? The significance of these footprints is difficult to overstate. For much of the 20th century, the consensus story of human arrival in the Americas was anchored to a specific technology. Finely crafted stone spear points first identified near Clovis, New Mexico. The quote, _6 model held that people arrived around 13,000 years ago. While earlier sites have long been debated, the evidence from White Sands is of a different order of certainty. A date range between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago doesn't just revise the timeline, it doubles the known duration of human history on the continent. It places people in the Tularosa Basin during the harshest period of the last ice age. This is an extraordinary claim, and it requires extraordinary evidence. The initial dating, published in 2021, was met with both excitement and appropriate scientific caution. In response, a follow-up study was conducted by the United States Geological Survey to test the original findings. The USGS team used two entirely different and independent methods. First, they used radiocarbon dating on ancient conifer pollen that was trapped in the exact same layers as the footprints. Because this pollen came from terrestrial trees, it avoided questions about how aquatic plants might absorb carbon from the ancient lake water. Second, they used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains, found within the footprint layers. This method measures the last time the quartz was exposed to sunlight. Both of these independent lines of evidence confirm the original age estimate. This is where our investigation must become precise. The footprints are direct, verifiable evidence of human presence. We can see the tracks of adults and children. We can infer movement, journeys, and daily life on the edge of a Pleistocene lake. This is a profound, unshakable connection to American deep time. But it is just as important to state what the footprints are not. They are not evidence of cities. They are not evidence of writing, metallurgy, or state-level society. They are a record of human beings, not a record of civilization. This distinction is the foundation of a careful inquiry. Each piece of evidence can only carry a certain amount of weight. To ask a footprint to prove a lost city is to break the chain of logic. To see a footprint as proof of deep human presence is to begin on solid ground. Having established this deeper timeline for human presence, the investigation can now move to the next logical question. If people were here during the last glacial maximum, what is the earliest evidence for large-scale, organised human construction on the continent? A footprint records a moment of presence. An earthwork records a plan. To find evidence of large-scale planning in the deep American past, we move from the Ice Age lake bed of New Mexico to a different kind of landscape. We go to northern Louisiana to a feature of higher ground in the lower Mississippi Valley known as Macon Ridge. Here, overlooking the floodplain, is a site that fundamentally challenges older, simpler models of human history. It is called Poverty Point. The site is not a city of stone, it is a vast integrated landscape of shaped earth. The central construction consists of 6 concentric ridges, arranged in semi-ellipses, which once stood about 1.5 meters high. These nested arcs are enormous, with an outer diameter of more than 1.14 kilometers. They are broken by aisles, or corridors, that radiate out from a huge central plaza covering about 15 hectares. Around this core, the builders also raised earthen mounds. 5 are still visible today. The largest, known as Mound A, is a staggering construction shaped like a bird in flight. It rises over 22 meters high and is composed of nearly 240,000 cubic meters of earth. The entire complex was built and used over a period of about 600 years, between 3,700 and 3,100 years before present. The scale is undeniable. The planning is self-evident. But the most profound fact about Poverty Point, the detail that shifts our understanding, is the identity of its builders. According to the consensus of archaeologists, and as recognised by its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, this monumental landscape was engineered by a society of hunter-fisher-gatherers. This is a crucial point in the investigation. The conventional story of civilization often follows a simple, linear path. First agriculture, then surplus food, then settled villages, which grow into cities, and only then comes the ability to organise the labour for monumental works. Poverty Point demonstrates that this sequence is not a universal law. Here, a large, stable community, living on the rich resources of the river valley, fishing, hunting, and gathering, organised themselves to move millions of baskets of earth to create a landscape of profound symbolic and social meaning, long before the emergence of large-scale agriculture in the region. The site isn't a mystery of who built it. It is a testament to what they could achieve. It asks us to look again at what we mean by complexity, and what kind of social and intellectual technology is required to shape the world on such a scale. The scale of the earthworks at Poverty Point presents a quiet but profound challenge. It does not fit a story of human progress that was once taught as a simple, linear sequence. For a long time, the accepted model was straightforward. First, a society develops agriculture. This allows for a food surplus and a sedentary lifestyle, where people can stay in one place. Only then, with food security and a settled population, can large-scale public works and monumental architecture emerge. The logic seems sound. You cannot organise thousands of people to move Earth for a generation if they are constantly on the move, searching for their next meal. Poverty Point contradicts this sequence. The archaeological evidence is clear. The people who built this landscape were not farmers. They were a complex society of hunter-fisher-gatherers. They drew their sustenance from the rich resources of the Mississippi floodplain, the fish, the game, the wild plants, and yet they achieved a level of planning and social organisation that was not supposed to be possible at that stage. This is not speculation. It is an interpretation grounded in the site's layout and material culture. The design itself is evidence of a master plan. The 6 concentric ridges are not a haphazard accumulation. They form a precise nested set of semicircles focused on the central plaza. This geometry speaks to a singular concept, a vision for the landscape that was maintained over centuries. To execute such a plan requires not just a blueprint, but a stable social structure capable of passing that knowledge and intention down through generations. The sheer volume of labour is another line of evidence. Estimates suggest the entire complex contains over 1.5 million cubic metres of earth. This work was done without draft animals, without wheeled carts, without metal tools. It was done basketful by basketful. The construction of just the largest mound, Mound A, would have required millions of hours of human labour. Some archaeological studies suggest this specific mound may have been constructed with incredible speed, perhaps in as little as 3 months. An effort like that requires a massive coordinated workforce, drawn from a wide region and organised for a specific shared purpose. This is not the work of a small isolated band. It is the signature of a regional social system, and the reach of that system is visible in the stone. The Macon Ridge, where the site is built, has no native stone. Yet, archaeologists have found tons of it at Poverty Point, worked into tools, weights for fishing nets, and polished decorative objects. This material was brought from far away. The sources have been traced across the continent. Soapstone from the Appalachian Mountains of Georgia and Alabama, flint from Ohio and Tennessee, copper from the Great Lakes region, over 1,000 kilometers to the north. This is not casual trade. It is evidence of a vast and stable network of exchange, a web of relationships connecting communities across thousands of square kilometers. Poverty Point was a hub, a pilgrimage center, a nexus of social and economic power for people living across a huge portion of the continent. Together, these threads, the unified architectural plan, the massive labour mobilisation, and the continent-spanning trade network, force us to reconsider what a hunter-gatherer society is capable of. The term does not have to mean simple or small scale. It represents a different path to complexity, one based on managing wild resources with such skill that it could support a large population, long-term projects, and a rich ceremonial life. It is a direct challenge to the idea that there is only one way for human societies to become complex. Poverty Point was a vast centre of ceremony, trade, and residence. But could a society on this continent take the next step, from a monumental centre to something we might recognise as a true city? For that, the investigation must move forward in time and further up the great river that sustained this world. The planning and labour mobilisation seen at Poverty Point represent one level of social complexity. But roughly 2,000 years later, and about 500 miles to the north, a different scale of human organisation emerged. Across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, in the fertile floodplain known as the American Bottom, lies the site of Cahokia. This was not a ceremonial centre visited seasonally, it was a city. Between the years 800 and 1400 CE, Cahokia grew to become the largest pre-Columbian urban centre north of Mexico. At its peak, its population is estimated to have been between 10,000 and 20,000 people. The city covered nearly 1,600 hectares and included about 120 man-made earthen mounds. The heart of this sprawling urban landscape was, and is, a colossal structure. Today it is called Monk's Mound. It is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, a terraced platform mound rising in 4 stages to a height of 30 metres, or about 100 feet. Its base covers more than 5 hectares, an area larger than that of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Like the ridges at Poverty Point, it was built by human hands, basketful by basketful, from earth dug nearby. Around Monk's Mound, a grand plaza stretched over some 19 hectares, levelled and engineered for large public gatherings. The city had distinct neighbourhoods, evidence of craft specialisation, and a 2-mile-long defensive palisade built of some 20,000 wooden logs. The scale is unambiguous. Cahokia demonstrates a level of population density, social hierarchy and public architecture that meets the definition of urbanism. It is evidence, written in the earth itself, of a complex American city that thrived for centuries. The sheer scale of Cahokia, the mathematical precision of its plazas and post circles, the sheer mass of Monk's Mound, these facts can feel so overwhelming that they invite a misleading question. For a long time, the question asked was not how this was built, but who. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, a persistent narrative took hold. It was called the myth of the mound builders. The idea proposed that a mysterious vanished race, often imagined as European or Near Eastern or from some other lost civilization, had constructed the great earthworks of North America and then disappeared, replaced by the indigenous peoples encountered by European settlers. It was a story born from a profound underestimation of the engineering, social and political capabilities of Native American societies. It created a false mystery, a phantom civilization where none was needed. 150 years of archaeology has provided a clear and conclusive correction. The evidence is unambiguous. The builders of Cahokia were not a lost race. They were the ancestors of modern Native American people. Specifically, they were the people of the Mississippian culture, a vast and interconnected network that flourished across the Midwest and Southeast for centuries. Their world was connected by the great river highways. Their societies were built on sophisticated agriculture, centered on the cultivation of maize. Their beliefs and social structures were complex enough to mobilize the labor, and were required to shape the very earth into a statement of cosmic and political order. The people who built Cahokia did not vanish. Their city declined, its population dispersed, and its cultural patterns transformed over generations, a cycle of rise and fall that is a common theme in human history. But the people themselves endured. Therefore, the power of Cahokia is not that it's an unsolvable mystery imported from somewhere else. Its power is that it is a documented part of this continent's own story. The surprise it generates is not evidence of an alien or lost civilization. It is evidence of how profoundly American history has been underestimated. The investigation here is not about a vanished people. It is about the documented complexity of the people who were always here. We have now seen evidence of human presence in North America stretching back into the Ice Age. We have seen monumental landscapes engineered by hunter-gatherers, and here we have seen a city that was, for a time, larger than London. The American record shows deep time, monumental construction, and urbanism. The investigation now moves west into the canyons of the desert to see a different kind of a large-scale organization, written not in earth, but in stone. From the dense urbanism of the Mississippi floodplain, our investigation now moves 700 miles west into a different kind of landscape and a different model of human organization. The ground here is the high, arid plateau of northwestern New Mexico. In this spare environment of sandstone sage and immense sky, a shallow canyon cuts through the desert floor. This is Chaco Canyon. For about 400 years, between 850 and 1250 of the Common Era, this canyon was the center of a cultural world built by the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples. The evidence they left is not in scattered villages, but in a series of immense planned structures known as great houses. These are among the most remarkable works of architecture in ancient North America. The largest and most famous is Pueblo Bonito. It is not a simple dwelling, but a D-shaped complex that grew through planned phases to contain more than 600 rooms, rising 4, perhaps even 5, stories in height. It was the largest apartment-style building in North America until the 19th century. The people of Chaco built with stone, developing a distinctive and beautiful masonry style. They constructed walls not of rough stacked rock, but of a sophisticated core and veneer technique. An inner core of rubble was faced on both sides with carefully fitted hand-cut sandstone, creating patterns that were both structurally sound and aesthetically refined. Timbers for the roofs and floors, some weighing hundreds of pounds, were transported from forests more than 50 miles away. This was an architecture of intention, requiring immense labour, long-term planning, and advanced engineering skills. But the full scale of the Chacan world is not visible from the canyon floor alone. Radiating out from the central canyon is a network of engineered roads. These are not simple footpaths worn into the earth. They are broad, remarkably straight avenues, often 10 meters wide, that run for dozens of miles across the desert. They do not deviate for minor obstacles. Instead, they ascend steep mesa cliffs using carved stairways and constructed ramps. More than 400 miles of these roads have been identified, connecting the great houses of Chaco Canyon to more than 150 outlying communities. or quote 7, which often feature their own smaller great houses built in the Chacan style. This vast network changes the entire question. Chaco was not just a collection of impressive buildings in one canyon. It was the hub of a system that organized an entire region. The purpose of this system is a subject of sustained archaeological investigation. The roads do not always connect to obvious resources, and their straightness suggests something more than simple economic transport. One interpretation is that they were ceremonial causeways, pathways for pilgrimage that tied the outlying communities to the spiritual and political center in the canyon. Another is that they were part of a system for moving goods, food, and information, integrating a dispersed population across a challenging landscape. What is clear is that the Chaco culture represents a form of complexity different from the urban density of Cahokia. It was a system built on connection across distance, on a shared architectural language, and on the monumental effort of shaping the landscape itself. The people of Chaco engineered not just buildings, but the very space between them, creating a social and ceremonial map written in stone and earth across thousands of square miles of the American Southwest. The vast network of structures and roads at Chaco Canyon raises a question that moves beyond engineering and into purpose. The scale of the system is clear. The investment of labor is undeniable. But what was it all for? The Chacan road network, for instance, does not behave like a modern highway system. The roads are often remarkably straight, running over hills and mesas rather than around them, suggesting their function was not purely practical transport. They appear to connect the great houses not just as points on a map, but as nodes in a conceptual web. This leads to an interpretation where the entire landscape was part of the architecture, a planned environment where movement itself may have been a form of ritual. This is where the investigation touches on the field of archaeoastronomy, the study of how past cultures understood and used the sky. At Chaco, it has been proposed that many of the great houses, and even the canyon itself, are aligned with significant solar and lunar events. One interpretation suggests that Pueblo Bonito is aligned on a north-south and east-west axis, and that other buildings mark the positions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes. The most famous and also most debated example is the Sun Dagger site on Fajardo Butte, an arrangement of stone slabs that allegedly cast patterns of light and shadow onto spiral petroglyphs, marking these key points in the solar year. This reading is compelling. It imagines the entire Chacan world as a calendrical device, a vast instrument for tracking time and embedding celestial order into the earth. It suggests a society deeply concerned with cycles, prediction, and the integration of human life with the cosmos. However, it is essential to mark this as an interpretation, not a settled fact. Proving that these alignments were intentional and not coincidental across a system built over centuries is a profound challenge. The arguments are complex, and the degree of astronomical knowledge involved is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion. There are no written documents from the Chacuan people to confirm their precise intentions. What remains, even without certainty about the stars, is the undeniable evidence of a powerful organizing principle. The Chacoan system connected dozens of outlier communities to a central place of immense ceremonial and political gravity. Whether the roads pointed to the solstice sunrise, or to other sacred mountains on the horizon, they were built to articulate a specific worldview. This was a society that organized memory, power, and meaning, not just within buildings, but across an entire region. They were engineering a landscape to reflect their understanding of the universe. The stone and earth of Chaco were made to hold a social and cosmic order. These American sites, the footprints at White Sands, the earthworks at Poverty Point, the city of Cahokia, and the ceremonial landscape of Chaco, present a record of deep time and human complexity that stands on its own. Each one challenges simpler, more linear stories about the past. Just as these sites forced a rethinking of American prehistory, another discovery, half a world away, would do the same for the story of civilization itself. The great houses of Chaco Canyon and the urban plaza of Cahokia are testaments to a vision that stretches our sense of the American past. They show that complex, large-scale organization has deep roots on the continent. But this investigation requires us to ask a further question. How far back can we find evidence for this kind of monumental, coordinated human effort anywhere in the world? For the answer, we travel from the American Southwest to a windswept rounded hilltop in southeastern Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. For decades, this hill was thought to be little more than a medieval cemetery, a place of no particular importance. But beginning in the 1990s, excavations led by the German Archaeological Institute revealed something else entirely, something that did not fit the established timeline of human history. Beneath the surface, archaeologists found not a city and not a village. They found a series of remarkable circular and oval enclosures. At their centre, and built into their walls, stand massive pillars of limestone, quarried and moved from nearby bedrock. Many are carved into a distinct T-shape, widely interpreted as stylized human forms. The largest of them stand over 5.5 meters tall and can weigh more than 7 tons. They are arranged with clear intent, forming structures that were built, used, and then, in a final, mysterious act, deliberately and carefully buried, entombed under thousands of cubic meters of earth. These pillars were not left blank. Their surfaces are covered with intricate high-relief carvings of animals. Not the domesticated animals of a farming village, but the wild creatures of a world before widespread agriculture. There are foxes, gazelles, snarling boars, cranes, and long slithering snakes. Scorpions and vultures, potent symbols of danger and transformation, are carved with a startling clarity and confidence. This was not random decoration. It was a complex symbolic system, a vocabulary rendered in stone. This level of artistry and architectural scale would be impressive in any ancient context. But the dating of Göbekli Tepe is what makes it a fundamental challenge. The main layers of monumental construction date to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, between 9600 and 8200 BCE. To place that in perspective, the oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe are some 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. They predate the Great Pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years. They were built before the invention of pottery, before the invention of writing, before the wheel. This is not a fringe claim or a contested theory. Göbekli Tepe is a designated UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its dating is firmly established through decades of careful excavation. It is what we can call an accepted anomaly. It is a fact on the ground that requires older, simpler stories about the human past to be revised. The linear model, that people first invented agriculture, then settled in villages, and only then developed the complex social structures needed to build monuments, is broken by this place. The age is one shock, the scale is another. But the deepest challenge to our understanding comes from the answer to a simple question. Who are the people with the social organization, the shared belief, and the technical skill to build it? The physical reality of Göbekli Tepe, its age, its scale, its deliberate burial, is enough to make it one of the most significant archaeological sites on Earth. But its true importance is not just in the what, but the who. The critical fact, established through decades of careful excavation and analysis, is that the people who built these monumental enclosures were hunter-gatherers. This single, established fact reverses a story about human development that was told for generations. The older, simpler model was linear and seemed logical. First came the invention of agriculture, around 10,000 years ago. This created reliable food surpluses, which allowed people to stop moving and settle down in permanent villages. With stable food and housing, populations grew, societies became more complex, and only then, with specialists fed by farmers, did people have the organization and the spare time to create large-scale monuments and temples, agriculture, then settlement, then monumentality. Göbekli Tepe shows this sequence is not the only path. The oldest layers of this site date to around 9600 BCE. This is a time before widespread farming, before domesticated animals, before pottery. Yet here are massive coordinated structures. The people who quarried, moved, and erected these multi-ton pillars were living on wild game and gathered plants. This means that a complex social and ritual life, capable of organizing immense long-term labor projects, did not wait for farming to begin. The desire to build something meaningful together may have been one of the very things that drew people into larger, more settled communities in the first place. The temple may have come before the town. This is not a fringe theory. It is the careful conclusion drawn from the evidence on the ground. The animal bones found at the site are all from wild species. There is no evidence of domesticated grains. Göbekli Tepe is a powerful accepted anomaly. It proves that we have consistently underestimated the social and intellectual capacity of pre-agricultural peoples. To accomplish this, these groups must have had a shared cosmology, sophisticated planning abilities, and a social structure capable of mobilizing and sustaining a large workforce over many generations. But this is also where caution is essential. Because Göbekli Tepe is a real and profound mystery, it is tempting to use it as a key to unlock all other speculative ideas. Yet the evidence does not support this. The site does not prove the existence of a lost, technologically advanced global civilization. It does not suggest inherited knowledge from an earlier age. What it proves is something more subtle, and perhaps more important, that the path to what we call civilization was more varied, more creative, and began much earlier than our simpler models once allowed. It provides a solid, evidence-based foundation for astonishment. And this foundation gives us a standard against which we can measure other, more controversial claims. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe represents a profound shift in the archaeological landscape. It is a fixed point, a piece of solid ground that forces a redrawing of the map of human capability in the early Neolithic. Its existence, its age, and its construction by hunter-gatherers are now part of the established, if still astonishing, record. But not all anomalies are of this kind. Any honest investigation into the deep past will eventually arrive at a different sort of landscape, a disputed frontier. This is the territory where new claims, often dramatic and exciting, have not yet been subjected to the slow, methodical process of verification that Göbekli Tepe has endured for decades. It is where initial reports, remote sensing data, or novel dating techniques suggest possibilities that have not yet achieved broad consensus. Crossing into this territory requires a different kind of attention. The core questions are no longer just quote 8 and quote 9. They become questions of method. How reliable is this data? Has it been independently replicated? What are the strongest counter-arguments from other specialists in the field? This is not a sign of failure or a lack of imagination. It is the signature of a living, active field of inquiry. An extraordinary claim, like a buried pyramid 20,000 years older than any known precedent, requires an extraordinary level of evidence. That evidence must be presented, reviewed, and tested. Sometimes, initial interpretations hold up and the map changes. Other times, further analysis reveals a more conventional explanation, or the data is found to be flawed. A headline is not a conclusion. To move forward with care, it is essential to distinguish between these different kinds of knowledge. There is the solid ground of a site like Göbekli Tepe, and then there is the frontier of debated claims. To treat them as equal would be to abandon the very process that allows for discoveries in the first place. Therefore, before considering the more speculative aspects of cultural memory, it is necessary to examine a case from this frontier, not to dismiss it, but to understand how such claims are tested. The process itself tells a story. To test the principle of extraordinary evidence, we can turn to a recent high-profile example. The case begins at a place called Gunung Padang in West Java, Indonesia. On the surface, it is a striking megalithic site built on a hilltop composed of 5 distinct terraces and constructed from columns of volcanic rock. For a long time, it has been recognized as a significant sacred site, with the visible layers generally dated to within the last few thousand years. However, a far more ambitious claim emerged from a multi-year research project involving geological surveys and core drilling. The research proposed that the hill itself was not entirely natural. Beneath the visible terraces, it was argued, lay a complex multi-layered structure, a buried pyramid, built in stages over an immense period of time. The oldest layers, based on radiocarbon dating of soil from deep drill cores, were proposed to be as old as 27,000 years. If true, this would make it the oldest pyramid on Earth, predating Göbekli Tepe by more than 15,000 years. The claim was precisely the kind of extraordinary proposition that this investigation is designed to examine. In October of 2023, the findings were published in the peer-reviewed scientific journal, Archaeological Prospection. The news travelled quickly, but the process of scientific verification does not end with publication. It begins there. Other researchers began to scrutinize the paper's methods and data. The core of the debate focused on a critical question. Did the dated soil samples contain clear, unambiguous evidence of human construction, artifacts, charcoal from a hearth, or other traces of cultural activity? Or were they simply dating the soil itself, which might be naturally much older than any structure built upon it? In March of 2024, the journal's publisher, Wiley, took a rare and significant step. They officially retracted the paper. The retraction notice stated that the investigation by the publisher and the journal editors concluded that the radiocarbon dating had been applied to natural soil samples that were not associated with any confirmed artifacts or features. Therefore, the conclusion that the site contained an ancient pyramid built by humans was, in their judgment, unsubstantiated. This outcome is not a story about suppression. It is the story of the evidence ladder in practice. The visible site at Gunung Padang remains an important place, but the extraordinary claim of a 27,000-year-old pyramid did not, in the end, provide the extraordinary evidence required. A responsible investigation must acknowledge the headline, but it must also respect the correction. This process, a bold claim, followed by intense scrutiny and revision, is not a failure of the search. It is the search itself. A similar dynamic, involving a real documented event surrounded by a fiercely debated cause, marks the investigation of a major climate shock from our deep past. The line between a confirmed site and a retracted claim is drawn by method. It is the process by which an extraordinary idea is tested against evidence until it is either supported or set aside. But what happens when the event itself is confirmed, but its cause remains one of the most contentious debates in earth science? This moves our investigation from the surface of the Earth to the climate system itself. It brings us to a period of time known as the Younger Dryas. To understand its significance, we must first picture the world as it was. The last glacial maximum was over. For several thousand years, the great continental ice sheets had been in a long, slow retreat. The planet was warming, sea levels were rising, new landscapes were opening up for plants, for animals, and for the human populations who hunted them. The overall direction of change was clear. From a world of ice to the warmer world we now inhabit. Then, around 12,900 years ago, this process did not just stop. It violently reversed. Across much of the northern hemisphere, the climate snapped back into a state of near glacial cold. Temperatures plummeted, in some regions, by several degrees Celsius. This was not a gradual cooling over centuries, but an abrupt, shocking shift. This period of intense cold would last for approximately 1,200 years, a chilling interruption in the planet's long thaw. This is not a speculative theory. The evidence for the Younger Dryas is written into the physical archives of the planet. It is recorded in the layered ice of the Greenland ice sheet, where chemical signatures show a sudden drop in atmospheric temperature. It is visible in the sediment cores drilled from the floors of ancient lakes, where the pollen from temperate forests is abruptly replaced by the pollen of cold-adapted plants. In fact, the period gets its name from one such plant, Dryas octopetala, an Arctic wildflower whose pollen became widespread during this cold snap, signalling the return of a tundra-like environment to regions that had been warming. For any human communities living at that time, the world they knew would have transformed within the span of a few generations, perhaps even a single lifetime. The forests would have retreated. The game animals they relied upon would have migrated or vanished. The climate would have become colder, drier, and far more severe. The existence of the Younger Dryas is a settled fact of climate science. The deep mystery, and the origin of a debate that touches on the very nature of catastrophic change, is the trigger. What could possibly cause the entire climate engine of the Northern Hemisphere to slam into reverse with such speed and force? The search for that cause is where this investigation must go next. A planet-scale shift in climate happening not over millennia, but over decades or perhaps even a few years, is an event that demands a cause. The evidence from the ice, the lake beds, and the ancient pollen is clear. Around 12,900 years ago, the warming trend reversed, and the Northern Hemisphere fell back into a deep cold. But the record of the effect does not automatically provide the record of the trigger. This is where the investigation moves from a widely accepted fact to a deeply contested frontier. The question of what caused the Younger Dryas has led to one of the most compelling and controversial scientific debates of recent decades. The proposed explanation is known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. In its direct form, the hypothesis argues that the abrupt cooling was triggered by a cosmic event, the airburst or impact of one or more fragments from a disintegrating comet or asteroid. Proponents of this idea suggest that such an event would have thrown immense amounts of dust and water vapor into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, and could have destabilized the North American ice sheets, triggering a massive influx of fresh water into the oceans and disrupting climate-regulating currents. The evidence presented for this hypothesis is microscopic. Researchers have pointed to a thin layer in sediments from the correct time period, a boundary layer, that they report contains materials suggesting an extraterrestrial event. These include things like nanodiamonds, metallic microspherules, and elevated levels of platinum, all of which can be formed under the extreme temperatures and pressures of an impact. The story is powerful. A cataclysm from the sky that reset the planet's climate and altered the course of life on Earth. However, an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence, and this is where the hypothesis enters the disputed frontier. Since it was first proposed, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has faced significant and persistent skepticism from many other researchers in the field. The objections are not minor. The first and perhaps most significant is the absence of a smoking gun, a confirmed impact crater or a field of craters dated precisely to the onset of the Younger Dryas. While some candidates have been proposed, none has been definitively linked to a 12,900-year-old event. Beyond the missing crater, other lines of evidence have been challenged. Some scientific teams have reported being unable to replicate the findings of impact markers at the boundary layer. They argue that some of the proposed indicators, like the nanodiamonds, might be misinterpreted or could have been formed by other, more common terrestrial events such as wildfires. Major skeptical reviews published in leading journals have argued that the hypothesis lacks a single, self-consistent scenario, and that the evidence for a widespread, simultaneous impact event is not yet conclusive. This is not a failure of the investigation. It is the investigation working as it should. A real and dramatic climate event is established fact. A dramatic potential cause has been proposed, and now that proposal is being subjected to intense scrutiny. The Younger Dryas is a powerful reminder that a genuine catastrophe can be preserved in the geological record, while its ultimate cause remains an open, unresolved, and scientifically vital question. The debate around the Younger Dryas reveals a core challenge in investigating the deep past. A real abrupt climate event is recorded in the ice and sediment, but the search for a single, dramatic trigger, a cosmic impact, remains a frontier of contested evidence. The signal of the effect is clear, the signal of the cause is not. But what happens when we leave these deep time ruptures and move closer to the present, to a period where written records, archaeology, and climate data can be woven together? What does the anatomy of a civilizational collapse look like when we can see it in higher resolution? Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were home to a deeply interconnected system of powerful states. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mycenaean palace kingdoms in Greece, the New Kingdom of Egypt, and major powers in Cyprus and the Levant. They were linked by sophisticated trade routes, formal diplomatic correspondence, and shared technologies. It was a Bronze Age world system, and then, over the course of just a few decades, much of it fell apart. This is now known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Major cities were violently destroyed and abandoned. Entire palace economies vanished. Long-distance trade in essential metals like tin and copper ceased. In many regions, the skill of writing itself was lost for centuries. For a long time, historians searched for a single cause. The most common explanation centered on the invasions of migrating groups, known from Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples. But more recent investigations reveal a more complex picture. A collapse of this magnitude is rarely the result of a single cause. It is more often a cascade failure, where multiple stresses hit a complex system at once, overwhelming its ability to adapt. And one of the most powerful stresses appears to have been climate. A study published in the journal Nature examined tree rings from ancient juniper trees preserved in a structure in central Anatolia, the Hittite heartland. This analysis provided a year-by-year record of climate conditions. It revealed a period of exceptionally severe and prolonged drought that began around 1198 BC and lasted for at least 3 consecutive years. For a civilization built on grain agriculture, a multi-year failure of the harvest would have been catastrophic, leading to famine, social unrest, and the inability to support armies or large urban populations. This drought was likely not the sole cause, but a critical catalyst. Imagine a system already under strain. The failure of agriculture weakens the central authority of the Hittite state. This disruption then ripples outward, interrupting the flow of goods along the trade routes that everyone depended on. Without a reliable supply of tin and copper, the production of bronze, the foundational material for weapons, tools, and elite goods, grinds to a halt. Economic collapse follows. Weakened and distracted states become vulnerable to internal rebellions and external attacks. The movements of the Sea Peoples in this light look less like an isolated cause and more like one more symptom of a world in crisis. People displaced by famine and instability, seeking new homes through migration and conflict. The Late Bronze Age collapse, then, offers a model for what we mean by systemic collapse. It's not an apocalypse that happens overnight. It is a rapid, cascading loss of complexity, where interconnected systems of food production, trade, politics, and security fail in sequence, reinforcing each other's decline. It's a stark reminder that even the most powerful and sophisticated societies are built on foundations that can prove to be profoundly fragile. The complex, interlocking failures of the Late Bronze Age show us one path to ruin. A system of trade, agriculture, and power becomes so tightly wound that a sufficient shock, or a series of smaller ones, can cause the entire structure to unravel. But there is another kind of catastrophe. Not a slow cascade, but a single, planetary-scale event, a hammer blow from the Earth itself. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in present-day Indonesia, a volcano named Toba erupted. This was not merely a large eruption. It was a super-eruption, one of the most powerful explosive events in the last 2 million years. The energy released was thousands of times greater than any eruption in recorded history. It ejected a colossal volume of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, enough to potentially trigger a volcanic winter, a sudden, dramatic cooling of the global climate lasting for years. For a long time, a compelling and starkly simple theory dominated the discussion of this event. It was known as the Toba catastrophe theory. The argument was that the ensuing volcanic winter was so severe, the ecosystem so disrupted, that it pushed our distant ancestors to the very edge of extinction. The human population, it was proposed, crashed to just a few thousand individuals, creating a genetic bottleneck from which all modern humans are descended. It is a powerful story of near annihilation and survival against impossible odds. But like many simple stories about the deep past, it has become more complex as more evidence has emerged. The Toba eruption absolutely happened. Its scale is not in dispute. What is now seriously questioned is the idea that it caused a uniform worldwide human collapse. The critical evidence for this more nuanced view comes from the other side of the planet, from archaeological sites along the coast of South Africa. In places like Pinnacle Point and Vliesby, researchers have found caves and rock shelters that were occupied by humans before, during, and after the Toba eruption. The layers of earth in these sites act as an archive. And this archive doesn't show a story of abandonment or collapse. Instead, it shows continuity. People continued to live there, to make sophisticated stone tools, to gather food from the sea and land. The chemical signature of the Toba ash has been found in these layers, confirming the timeline. But the human activity simply carries on. Some evidence even suggests that the environmental pressures spurred innovation rather than extinction. This does not mean the Toba eruption was a minor event. For those living closer to the volcano, the consequences were likely apocalyptic. But the evidence from southern Africa reveals a crucial truth about humanity: resilience. It suggests that our species was not a fragile monolith, but a diverse and widely distributed network of populations. Some groups may have perished, while others, in regions with more stable resources, adapted and endured. The story of Toba is no longer a simple narrative of a bottleneck. It is a more complex and perhaps a more profound story about the unevenness of catastrophe and the deep roots of human adaptability. It cautions against assuming that any single event, no matter how immense, can have a simple, predictable effect on a species as resourceful and scattered as our own. It shows that survival, just as much as collapse, is a fundamental part of the human record, and it raises a new question. If our deep ancestors could navigate a genuine supervolcanic winter, what does that tell us about the fragilities we face today? The collapses of the past, whether driven by drought, conflict, or systemic decay, offer a deep and often unsettling mirror. But what of the present? What forces, visible or invisible, define the stability of the world we currently inhabit? To explore this, our investigation moves from the ancient eastern Mediterranean to the heart of the North American continent, to a landscape known for its dramatic beauty and for the immense power sleeping just beneath its surface. Yellowstone National Park, a place of geysers, hot springs, and abundant wildlife. It is also the site of one of the largest known volcanic systems on Earth. The park itself sits within the Yellowstone caldera, a vast depression in the ground left by a super eruption that occurred roughly 631,000 years ago. This fact has become a common feature in stories about modern fragility. The narrative is often presented as simple arithmetic. Major eruptions occurred around 2.1 million, 1.3 million, and 631,000 years ago. By averaging these long, irregular intervals, some have concluded that the system is quote 11 for another cataclysm. This is a powerful story. But according to the agency tasked with monitoring this system, the United States Geological Survey, or USGS, it is not an accurate one. The evidence from geology points to a different conclusion. First, volcanoes do not erupt on a fixed schedule. The idea of an eruption being quote, _12, is a human projection of order onto a complex non-linear natural system. The USGS is clear that the past is not a simple clock predicting the future. Second, and more importantly, the system is among the most intensely monitored geological features on the planet. The Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, a partnership between the USGS, the University of Utah, and the University of Wyoming, maintains a constant watch. This monitoring is not passive. It involves a network of seismometers tracking the thousands of small earthquakes that occur in the region each year. It uses high-precision global positioning system stations, GPS stations, to measure subtle changes in ground elevation, watching for the kind of swelling that would indicate magma is moving towards the surface. Scientists analyze the chemistry of gases released from the park's thermal features and use satellite imagery to monitor ground temperature. This constant stream of data provides a detailed picture of the volcano's behavior, and that picture, according to the evidence, is not one of imminent catastrophe. The USGS states that there are no signs of an impending eruption. In fact, their analysis suggests that the magma chamber beneath Yellowstone is mostly solid, with a much smaller percentage of molten rock than would be needed to fuel a supereruption. The annual probability of another massive caldera-forming event is estimated to be about 1 in 730,000. That is a probability of roughly 0.00014%. The odds of a smaller, but still significant lava flow are higher, but still exceptionally low on a human timescale. So if Yellowstone is not a ticking clock, what is its purpose in this investigation? Its true value is not as a forecast, but as a scale. It is a physical reminder that our civilization, with its cities, its power grids, its digital archives, exists on a thin crust of a geologically active planet. The power contained beneath the park is real. It simply operates on a timeline that is largely indifferent to human affairs. The threat is not one of urgency, but of perspective. The ground beneath us, according to the best available data, is stable, but the complex interconnected systems we have built upon that ground, that is a different matter. While a supervolcano is a low-probability, high-impact event, there are other forces, more subtle and perhaps more probable, that can test the resilience of the world we have made. The geologic timescale of a threat like the Yellowstone caldera offers a strange kind of reassurance. The risk is real, but its rhythm is not human. It is a planetary process, not an appointment. But not all systemic risks operate on such a vast and slow-moving clock. Some threats travel at the speed of light, and our dependence on them has grown so total, so fast, that the historical precedent feels less like a warning and more like an echo from a different world. The anchor for this kind of fragility is not a layer of ash, but an event recorded in the sky and on copper wires. It happened on September 1st and 2nd in the year 1859. An English astronomer named Richard Carrington was sketching sunspots when he witnessed an intense burst of white light on the sun's surface, a massive solar flare. Less than 18 hours later, the charged particles from that flare struck the Earth's magnetic field. The result was the most powerful geomagnetic storm on record. The most immediate effects were on the most advanced technology of the day, the global telegraph network. In telegraph offices from Boston to Paris, operators watched as sparks flew from their equipment. Some reported that the paper used for recording messages caught fire. In a few documented cases, operators disconnected their batteries entirely and found they could continue to send and receive messages, powered only by the electrical current induced in the wires by the storm itself. For most of the world's population, the event was not a technological crisis but a celestial spectacle. The northern and southern lights, the auroras, were seen across the planet. People in the Rocky Mountains woke up in the middle of the night, thinking it was dawn. Newspapers reported that the glow was bright enough to read by. Auroras were seen as far south as Cuba and Hawaii. In 1859, this was a curiosity. The planet-wide system of electrical dependence did not yet exist. Today, our world is built on that system. The power grid is not just an appliance. It is the operating system for everything else. It runs the pumps that deliver water, the refineries that produce fuel, the servers that hold financial records, and the satellites that provide the Global Positioning System, or GPS, which is essential for timing everything from stock trades to cell phone calls. A storm on the scale of the Carrington event today would not just be a spectacle. According to studies by organizations like the National Academy of Sciences, it could induce powerful direct currents, or DC, into the alternating current, or AC grid. These currents could overload and destroy the largest, most critical components of the system, the high-voltage transformers. These are not devices that can be mass-produced quickly. They are custom-built, weigh hundreds of tons, and can take months or even years to replace. The failure of a few hundred of these transformers across a continent could create a cascade of blackouts lasting not for days or weeks, but potentially for months or longer. This isn't just a power outage. It is the potential for a long-term unraveling of the complex systems that support modern life. The fragility, then, is not in the ground beneath us. It is in the invisible web of dependencies we have woven around the globe in just a few generations. A civilization that runs on electricity also remembers on electricity. And that raises a difficult question about preservation. The vulnerability exposed by an event like the 1859 solar storm is not just about power grids or communication. It points to a deeper question about what our civilization chooses to remember and what medium it uses for that memory. The entire investigation, from a clay prism in a museum to footprints in New Mexico, has been a study of survival. Not just the survival of people, but the survival of information. Each form of evidence we have examined is a different medium of memory with its own strengths and weaknesses. The Weld-Blundell Prism is fired clay. It is physically fragile. It can be shattered. But if it is buried and left undisturbed, it is chemically stable for millennia. Its memory of the antediluvian kings is preserved in physical impressions. To read it, one needs light, and knowledge of a language and script that have been painstakingly recovered over centuries. Its survival is accidental, but its physical form is simple and durable. The limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe are another medium. Stone is immensely more durable than clay. It resists the elements, preserving the form of the T-shapes and the reliefs of the animals carved upon them. The memory it holds is one of symbolic intent and immense labour. But while the medium survives, its precise meaning is lost to interpretation. We have the statement, but not the language it was spoken in. It is a powerful but mute witness. The earthworks at Poverty Point or the mounds at Cahokia represent memory on a landscape scale. They are built from the soil itself. They are vulnerable to erosion, to agriculture, to modern construction. Yet their sheer mass gives them a unique form of persistence. They become part of the topography. Their memory is one of organisation, of shared purpose, and of a human design imposed upon the land. Like the pillars, their exact function is debated, but their existence is an undeniable record of a complex social order. Now consider the primary medium of our own time: a hard drive, a solid-state drive, a server farm. In a space smaller than the clay prism, we can store the entire library of cuneiform literature, along with every photograph, map, and document related to Göbekli Tepe and Cahokia. The density and accessibility of the information is orders of magnitude beyond anything that came before. But this power comes with a unique fragility. The data on that drive is not a physical impression. It is a series of magnetic states or electrical charges that are meaningless, without a long and unbroken chain of technology. To read it, a future investigator would need a source of electricity. They would need compatible hardware, the correct cables, the correct reader. They would need functioning software that can understand the file system, and then understand the file formats themselves. If any single link in that chain is broken, the drive becomes a silent, useless object. The richest archive in human history could become the most inaccessible. This is the paradox of our own age of memory. We create and store more information than all previous generations combined, but we entrust that memory to the most complex and dependent medium ever devised. A clay tablet, once fired, asks for nothing. A digital file asks for everything. It requires the continued existence of the entire infrastructure that created it. The question of what survives us is no longer just about what is recorded. It is about whether anyone, including our own descendants, will have the key to read it. Clay, stone, and earth have carried their messages, however partial, across thousands of years. But these are not the only ways to preserve memory. There is another medium, older than all of them, which requires no external technology at all. Our investigation into the media of memory has shown us the endurance of clay and stone and the profound fragility of our own digital world. A server farm can hold more information than all the scribes of Sumer, but it depends on a constant flow of power and a chain of compatible technologies that can be broken in an instant. When a civilization's memory is written on a medium that requires a functioning civilization to read it, its long-term survival becomes a paradox. This raises a question. What if there are other forms of memory, older than writing, that possess a different kind of durability? We have looked at records made on things, on clay, in earth, on hard drives. But what about records made of people? This brings us to the most ancient and intimate medium of all, the oral tradition. This is not simply telling stories. In many cultures, oral tradition is a disciplined technology for preserving essential knowledge. Histories, genealogies, lore, and maps of the landscape, all encoded in narrative and performance, passed from one generation to the next. For a long time, it was assumed that these traditions were fluid, changing with every telling, and could not possibly preserve accurate information over deep time. But new research asks us to reconsider that assumption. An investigation by scholars, including Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, has focused on the oral traditions of Aboriginal peoples in Australia. They gathered stories from different coastal groups, stories about the world of the past, and a distinct pattern emerged. These traditions speak of a time when the sea level was much lower. They describe former coastlines, speak of places that are now underwater, and recount how the ocean rose and drowned the land. One story tells of a man named Ngurunderi chasing his wives, their pursuit carving out the course of the Murray River, and how the sea rose behind them, filling what is now Spencer Gulf. Others describe islands that were once connected to the mainland, or hunting grounds that are now submerged reefs. When geologists compare these narratives to the established timeline of post-glacial sea level rise, the correspondence is remarkable. The landscapes described in these stories match the Paleos shorelines that existed before the ocean stabilized. The research makes a careful but powerful case that these traditions preserve direct eyewitness accounts of coastal inundation. The timeline for these events is not a few hundred years. It is more than 7,000 years. This is a profound discovery. It suggests that, under the right conditions of cultural continuity and deep connection to a specific place, human memory, transmitted orally, can remain stable and accurate across hundreds of generations. It is not a perfect record. It is not a scientific paper. It is memory, encoded into the form it needs to survive. The story of Ngurunderi is not a geological report, but it may hold a geological truth. This does not mean every flood myth around the world is a literal record. That would be a careless overstatement. Instead, this specific, well-researched example serves as a proof of concept. It demonstrates that cultural memory is not confined to physical objects. It can be a living archive, carried in the minds and voices of people. It forces us to treat ancient traditions not as mere fantasy, but as complex vessels of knowledge whose contents we have only begun to understand. Our investigation began with a single object, a prism of baked clay from southern Iraq, small enough to hold in two hands, covered in the wedge-shaped marks of a language thousands of years old. From that concrete starting point, the Weld-Blundell Prism, a question unfolded. The text it held, the Sumerian King List, offered not just a sequence of rulers, but a structural memory of a world before a great flood, with kings who reigned for impossibly long lifetimes. That text forced us to confront the limits of evidence. What parts were history? What parts were ideology? And what parts might be the compressed, distorted memory of a much deeper past? This led us away from the text alone and into the physical world. We saw how localized floods in Mesopotamia could create a cultural memory of total destruction. And we saw how a far larger, slower, and more certain erasure was written into the planet itself. The rise of the oceans after the last ice age, a process that submerged coastlines and silently removed entire landscapes from the archaeological map. The silence in the record, we found, is not always an empty silence. From that planetary scale absence we turned to presence, to evidence that was not lost, but merely waiting, its significance overlooked. In the ancient lake beds of New Mexico we found the footprints at White Sands, irrefutable proof of human presence on the American continent more than 21,000 years ago, a timeline far deeper than older models allowed. And on the ridges above the Mississippi, we found the planned, monumental landscapes of Poverty Point and the urban scale of Cahokia, complex indigenous societies that challenge any simple, linear story of what civilization is and how it begins. We saw how accepted anomalies like Göbekli Tepe can force a recalibration of our timelines, proving that complex ritual and large-scale construction are themselves ancient. And we tracked the mechanisms of collapse, from the multi-system failures of the Late Bronze Age to the unique fragilities of our own time. We have followed a trail of evidence made of clay, of drowned shorelines, of footprints in hardened mud, of monumental earthworks, of broken trade networks, and of durable stories. And so now, we return to the question that the prism first suggested, not as a simple claim to be proven or disproven, but as a framework for what we have seen. The journey has not produced a neat ledger of 6 previous worlds. The evidence is too fragmented, too complex for such a simple accounting. What has emerged is a pattern of deep time, of profound loss, of unexpected complexity, and of recurring collapse. The question is not, did a scribe in 1800 BCE have an accurate count? The question is, what kind of human story does this collection of fragments, from Mesopotamia to North America, from deep time to the recent past, actually tell? So, are we the 7th civilization? The evidence we have followed, from a clay prism in a museum to footprints in ancient mud, does not prove that number. No reliable source confirms 6 advanced global societies before our own. To state otherwise would be to trade a real investigation for a simple, unsupported claim. But the purpose of this journey was never to validate a number. It was to test a question. And the question remains powerful because it changes the shape of the past we think we inhabit. It challenges a simple linear story of progress, where humanity moves in a straight line from stone tools to server farms. The record, when examined with care, suggests something else. Not a line, but a pattern of pulses, a rhythm of invention, organization, collapse and memory, often fragmented memory. This is the deeper meaning of a cyclical history. It is not about a fixed count of repeating ages. It is the recognition that complexity is not a one-time achievement, that systems of order are fragile, and that the Earth itself is an active participant in the story, capable of erasing the worlds built upon it. The media of memory we have encountered each tell their own part of this story. There is the Weld-Blundell Prism, a small object of fired clay created around 3,800 years ago. It preserves a formal ideological memory of a world split in two by a great flood. It is durable enough to survive millennia, yet its meaning is not literal. It is a memory encoded as world view. There are the footprints at White Sands, 23,000 years old. They are the memory of a single moment, of presence, of movement. They record no grand history, no king's name. They are simply the trace of human life, preserved by geological chance, a form of memory more direct and more fragile than any text. There are the great earthworks at Poverty Point, the mounds of Cahokia. Memory built at the scale of a landscape, one basket of earth at a time. They record immense social organization and a deep understanding of place, a collective memory that can endure even when the language and politics that built it have vanished. And then there is our own medium, the digital archive, the server, the silent hard drive, a form of memory more vast and detailed than any that came before it. But it is a memory that depends on a constant supply of power, on compatible hardware, on software that is not forgotten. A memory that is, perhaps, the most abundant and the most fragile of all. A clay tablet, a footprint, an earthen mound, a digital file. None of them proves a lost golden age or a precise count of fallen worlds. But together they ask us to consider the past with more humility and more wonder. They suggest that what we have lost is not just a list of names and dates, but entire ways of being, and they place a quiet responsibility on the present. The question is not whether we are the seventh civilization, but what pieces of our own story will survive the long, slow, inevitable processes of forgetting.